Where did you find the courage to touch my hair, human? She came to my tent that night. HFY Ethan Cade had been on countless worlds, facing dangers that would have made any normal person's heart stop. But none of those missions had prepared him for the one he was about to embark on. Griveth 5 was a world unlike any other, a harsh, unforgiving planet where only the strong survived. It had been a conflict zone for years, a battleground between alien races, each one more hostile than the last. He was here not as a soldier, but as a scout, sent by the Galactic Coalition to monitor the growing tensions in the area. The mission was simple: observe, gather intelligence, and report back. He was to stay out of the way, not get involved. But when had a mission ever gone according to plan? The night was darker than usual on Griveth 5, the moon barely visible through the thick, stormy clouds that churned across the sky. Ethan sat in his tent, a small, collapsible structure meant for one person, though he could hardly call it comfortable. It was just a place to rest, a shelter from the dust and the ever-present threat of violence outside. He didn't expect peace on this planet, but a little quiet wouldn't have hurt. As he sat, going over his notes from the day's observations, he felt the familiar tingle of unease creeping up his spine. The feeling wasn't new to him, it was part of the job. You never knew who or what could be lurking in the shadows. But tonight, something felt different. It wasn't just the usual threat of hostile alien forces or environmental dangers. It was something more personal. A sound broke the silence, soft footsteps, barely audible against the howling wind outside. At first, Ethan thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, closer this time. His hand instinctively reached for the blaster at his side, but he hesitated. The movement was too deliberate to be a wild animal. No, this was something else. Ethan stood up cautiously, his boots making a soft noise against the hard ground as he moved toward the flap of the tent. He peered outside, his heart racing for reasons he couldn't entirely understand. The moonlight barely illuminated the landscape, but he could make out a tall figure standing at the edge of his camp. The figure was humanoid but distinctly alien. It was tall, with dark, almost shimmering skin and long, flowing hair that caught the faint light of the moon. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any alien. This was Arlakoth. Arlakoth was a member of the Talvani, one of the most feared warrior races in the galaxy. They were known for their brutal strength and unmatched combat skills. The Talvani were as much a force of nature as they were a people. To call them warriors was an understatement. To cross them was to sign your death sentence. And yet there she was, standing in front of his tent, staring at him as if she was looking straight into his soul. Ethan didn't know why she was here, but he knew he had to act fast. His mind raced with all the possibilities, none of them good. Was she here to kill him? Was she on a mission from her people? Had he done something to offend the Talvani? Before he could make any decisions, Arlakoth stepped closer, her movements fluid and graceful, a sharp contrast to the fierce reputation of her kind. She didn't speak at first, but her presence was overwhelming, as if the very air around her had thickened. Ethan stood frozen, unsure whether to reach for his blaster or to simply stay still. And then, without warning, she stepped into the tent. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively backed away, making room for her in the confined space. She didn't seem to care about the smallness of the tent, her imposing frame seeming to fill every inch of the space. "What do you want?" Ethan finally managed to say, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Arlakoth didn't answer immediately. She simply observed him, her dark eyes studying him with a strange intensity. Ethan had been in the presence of many different alien species before, but there was something different about the way Arlakoth looked at him. It wasn't just curiosity or hostility. It was something deeper, something that made his skin prickle with a mixture of caution and intrigue. Her voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "You're human." Ethan nodded, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "Yes, what do you want from me?" Again, Arlakoth didn't answer. Instead, she reached up and slowly, carefully touched the side of his head. Ethan froze, his body going rigid at the unexpected touch. He felt a shiver run through him, the sensation of her fingers light against his skin. She didn't say anything, but her touch lingered for a moment before she slowly withdrew her hand. Ethan blinked, trying to process what had just happened. He'd been in close quarters with aliens before, but never had one touched him like that, especially not without some sort of threat or intimidation behind it. This was different, and strangely enough, it wasn't threatening. It felt almost comforting, though he couldn't explain why. Her eyes never left his face as she spoke again. "Where did you find the courage to touch my hair, human?" Ethan's mind raced. "What do you mean?" he asked, still trying to understand the meaning behind her words. "I didn't— Your hair," she interrupted, her voice almost gentle now. "It's different, it's softer, I've never seen anything like it." Ethan felt a flush rise to his face at the unexpected comment. He hadn't really thought about his hair before. To him, it was just something that grew on his head, nothing remarkable about it, but Arlakoth seemed to think otherwise. "Look," he said, trying to keep the conversation on track. "I don't know why you're here or what you want from me, but I'm just a scout. I'm not here to cause any trouble." Arlakoth didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked around the small tent, her movements graceful yet purposeful. Ethan watched her, his mind still reeling from the unexpected encounter. She was unlike anything he had ever faced, fierce, yet curious, dangerous, yet oddly gentle. "I wanted to know," she said quietly, turning to face him again, "why you are different, why you are not like the others." Ethan didn't know what to say. He had always been told that humans were weak in the eyes of other species, that they were small, fragile, and insignificant. But here was Arlakoth, a Talvani warrior, questioning him as though he held some secret. It was bewildering. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Maybe because I'm just trying to survive, like everyone else." Arlakoth regarded him for a moment longer, her eyes piercing into him as if she was searching for something he didn't understand. Then, without a word, she turned and left the tent, her presence fading into the night as quietly as she had arrived. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his mind swirling with confusion. What had just happened? Why had Arlakoth come to him? What was it about him that had made her seek him out? One thing was clear: this encounter was far from over. And whatever it was that had drawn Arlakoth to him, Ethan had a feeling it was going to change everything. The days after Arlakoth's unexpected visit to Ethan's tent were long and tense. As much as he tried to focus on his mission, gathering intel, observing the Talvani movements, and avoiding trouble, his mind kept drifting back to her. The alien warrior who had stood in his tent, touching his hair as if it was the most fascinating thing in the galaxy. Ethan had seen many strange things in his time on Grivath 5, but nothing like that. Nothing that made him question everything he thought he knew about the universe. Arlakoth was a mystery, one that he couldn't seem to unravel. She wasn't like the other Talvani warriors he had heard about in the Galactic Coalition's reports. She wasn't just a fighter, a ruthless killer. There was something else about her, something beneath the surface that Ethan couldn't quite grasp. For the next few days, Ethan went about his usual routine, trying to stay out of trouble. He spent his time surveying the war-torn landscape, recording the movements of the rival alien factions, and making sure he didn't cross paths with anyone who might be looking to kill him. It was a lonely existence, one that he had grown used to. But that loneliness was different now. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Arlakoth's face, her dark eyes, the intensity in her gaze, and that strange, almost gentle touch of her hand against his head. It was the evening of the fourth day when he saw her again. Ethan had just finished eating a small, bland meal in the quiet of his tent. The wind outside was picking up, howling through the barren landscape, making everything feel even more desolate. As he cleaned his mess kit, he heard it, the same soft footsteps, the same sound that had made him so alert that first night. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. It couldn't be her again, could it? Before he could react, the flap of the tent opened, and there she was. Arlakoth, she looked different this time. Instead of the usual warrior armor and weapons that most Talvani wore, she was dressed in simple clothes, much like what he had seen some of the other aliens on the planet wear. The change in her appearance threw him off. She didn't look like a fighter right now, she looked almost human. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to ask why she kept showing up, what she wanted from him, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The words felt wrong. Instead, he just stood there watching her as she stepped further into the tent. "Why are you here?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Arlakoth didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him, her eyes softening in a way that Ethan hadn't seen before. She looked different than the warrior he had met days ago. There was no anger or aggression in her gaze now, only curiosity. "I have been watching you," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "You are different from the others. You are not like the ones who come here for conquest or for war." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. He had never been one to stand out. He had always been just another soldier in a vast, endless galaxy, nothing special. But Arlakoth saw something in him that he couldn't understand. "I'm just a scout," Ethan said with a shrug. "I'm here to observe, not to fight, not to conquer." Arlakoth's lips curled slightly at the corners, almost as if she was amused. "A scout, yes, but you have courage." "I have never seen courage like yours." Ethan was taken aback. Courage? He hadn't done anything remarkable. He had just been doing his job, staying out of the way of trouble. He had no idea what she saw in him. "I'm not a warrior," he replied, still trying to understand her. "I don't fight, I survive." Arlakoth's eyes glimmered in the dim light of the tent. "You do more than survive, you endure." There was a pause, and for the first time, Ethan felt as though he was being seen for something deeper than just a human in an alien world. "Why do you keep coming here?" Ethan asked, his voice full of quiet curiosity. Arlakoth didn't answer right away. Instead, she moved closer, her eyes not leaving his face. Ethan felt his heart beat faster. She wasn't threatening him. She wasn't here to harm him. But there was something in her presence that made the air feel charged, like the tension before a storm. "I wanted to understand," she said softly, her gaze now shifting to his hair again. "What is it about you that is different? The others, they are like machines driven by violence, but you—" She trailed off for a moment, her words faltering. "You are not like them. Why?" Ethan didn't know how to answer her question. He had always thought of himself as just another person trying to survive in a universe that didn't care. But Arlakoth was right. He wasn't like the others, wasn't like the soldiers he had seen in the coalition. There was something about him that was human. Something more than just survival. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe it's just the way humans are. We're not the strongest or the toughest, but we have a way of getting through things. We find a way to keep going." Arlakoth seemed to consider his words carefully. Then, without warning, she reached out again, her fingers brushing his hair. The touch was gentler this time, almost tender. Ethan couldn't help but flinch at first, but as he met her gaze, he realized she wasn't trying to hurt him. She wasn't threatening him. She was simply curious. "What is this?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. "My hair," Ethan replied, surprised by the question. "It's just hair, it grows out of my head." Arlakoth's fingers lingered for a moment longer before she pulled her hand back. "It is not like the hair of my people," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It is softer, different, I do not understand." Ethan chuckled softly, a little nervous but amused. "It's just hair, it doesn't mean anything." But Arlakoth was still watching him, her eyes intense, as if trying to decipher something he couldn't see. "Everything means something," she said, almost to herself. Ethan was unsure of what to say next. The conversation had turned strange, and he didn't know how to navigate this moment with her. Arlakoth was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't just a warrior. She wasn't just a fearsome Talvani. She was someone who was willing to look deeper than the surface, someone who saw more than just the obvious. It was unsettling, but it was also intriguing. She turned away from him then, her movements fluid, graceful, and yet powerful, as though she was already preparing to leave. But before she stepped out of the tent, she looked back at him one last time. "Thank you, human," she said quietly, "for showing me that not all are driven by violence. You are different, and that is something I will not forget." And with that, she left, disappearing into the night, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts once again. He didn't know what to make of Arlakoth or the strange connection that was growing between them. But one thing was certain, nothing about this mission was going to be the same. Ethan had always believed in surviving. But now, with Arlakoth's words echoing in his mind, he wondered if there was something more he was meant to do here, on this harsh, unforgiving world. He just had to figure out what it was. The days passed in a blur of routine for Ethan. Each day, he set out to monitor the movements of the rival alien factions, keeping his distance and staying out of their way. He took his role as a scout seriously, knowing that his purpose was to observe and report, not to get involved in the conflicts between the aliens. Yet as much as he tried to focus on his mission, one thought kept creeping into his mind: Arlakoth. It had been several days since she had last visited him in the tent. She had left without another word, but the encounter had left a mark on him. The questions she had asked, the way she had touched his hair, it had all been so unusual. Ethan had no idea what she saw in him, what drew her to him. Was it just his humanity, or was there something more, something he hadn't yet figured out? As much as Ethan tried to keep his distance from the Talvani warrior, a part of him couldn't help but wonder about her. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Powerful yet gentle, fierce yet curious. Ethan had met many warriors during his time in the galaxy, but none like her. Arlakoth wasn't just another soldier, she was something else entirely. One evening, as Ethan made his way back to his camp after another day of watching and waiting, he saw her again. This time it was different. He had just finished setting up his tent and preparing his evening meal when he heard the soft crunch of footsteps in the gravel. He tensed, instinctively reaching for the blaster at his side. But when he looked up, there she was, Arlakoth, standing at the edge of his camp just as she had done before. She didn't say anything at first, but her presence was enough to make Ethan's heart race. It wasn't fear, not exactly. But it was a strange feeling, a mix of curiosity and caution. He had no idea why she kept showing up, but part of him didn't mind. Despite the uncertainty that always surrounded her, he found himself drawn to her. "Arlakoth," he said cautiously, rising to his feet. "What do you want now?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on him. There was something different about her this time. Her expression wasn't as distant or unreadable as it had been before. She seemed uncertain. "I have been thinking," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "About what you said about survival, about enduring." Ethan blinked, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" "The Talvani are not like your people," Arlakoth continued. "We fight. We conquer, that is our way. We do not survive, we dominate." She paused for a moment, almost as if she was trying to understand her own words. "But you endure, you survive, and yet you do not seem weak. I do not understand it." Ethan frowned, unsure of what she was getting at. "I don't know, it's just how humans are. We don't give up no matter what." Arlakoth's gaze softened as she took a few more steps forward. She was so close now that Ethan could see the faint scars on her skin, marks of the countless battles she had fought in. It was a reminder of the harshness of her life. Yet in that moment she didn't seem like the fearsome warrior everyone said she was. She seemed almost human. "You are not afraid?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan looked her in the eye, a little surprised by the question. "Of course I'm afraid, I'm just good at hiding it." Arlakoth was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face as though trying to find something she couldn't name. "I have seen fear in many faces, but yours is different. You do not fear death. You fear something else." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling his chest tighten. He had never thought about it that way. Fear wasn't something he liked to talk about, but Arlakoth was right. He didn't fear death. It was a part of life, especially for someone like him who had lived through so many dangerous missions. But there was something else he feared. Something he had never said aloud. "I fear failing," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fear not doing enough, not being able to help the people who need it, not making a difference." Arlakoth seemed to consider his words for a long moment. Her eyes softened further, and for the first time, Ethan saw something like understanding in her gaze. It was strange to see that look from a warrior who had lived a life of constant battle, someone who had never been taught to think in terms of compassion or care for others. "You are a strange human," Arlakoth said after a moment. "You talk of fear of failure, but you do not run from it. You face it head-on as though it is a challenge to be overcome, not something to escape." Ethan felt a strange warmth spread through him at her words. He had always known that humans were capable of more than just survival. He had always believed that there was strength in vulnerability, in facing fear instead of hiding from it. But hearing it from someone like Arlakoth, hearing her say that he wasn't weak for feeling those things, made him realize something important. Maybe he wasn't so alone in his thinking after all. "You're not like the others," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Arlakoth didn't respond at first. She simply stood there, staring at him with that unreadable expression, as though weighing his words. Ethan could feel the tension rising between them, thickening the air with every passing second. He wasn't sure what it was, whether it was the way she looked at him or the way he was starting to feel about her, but the air around them seemed to hum with an unspoken connection. Finally, Arlakoth spoke, her voice steady but soft. "Perhaps I am not. Perhaps I have never been." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He was still trying to wrap his mind around everything that had happened between them. He wasn't sure where it was leading, but something inside him told him that whatever it was, it would change everything. Just then, a sharp, distant sound cut through the quiet of the night. It was a crackling sound, like something exploding in the distance. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He instantly knew what it was, a battle. The rival alien factions had finally found him. It was time to move. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed his blaster and turned to Arlakoth. "We need to go now." Arlakoth nodded, her expression hardening once again. The warrior within her had returned, the focus and determination that had been missing during their conversation now fully in place. "I will fight beside you," she said, her voice firm. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. And with Arlakoth by his side, he wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope. The sound of battle grew louder as they moved toward the source. Both Ethan and Arlakoth knew the odds were stacked against them, but neither of them flinched. For once, they weren't just survivors. They were partners, fighting not just for their own lives, but for something bigger than themselves. As they ran toward the danger, Ethan felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about proving that even in the midst of war, there was more to life than just the fight. And maybe, just maybe, it was about something else entirely, something that neither of them had yet fully understood. Ethan could feel the tension in the air as he and Arlakoth made their way toward the sound of battle. The crackling of weapons, the distant thuds of explosions, and the chaotic shouts of alien voices reverberated through the ground beneath his boots. It wasn't just a battle, it was a war. He could already see the dust rising in the distance, the telltale signs of a clash between two rival alien factions. Arlakoth was by his side, her presence steady and calm, but there was something else in her eyes, something that made Ethan realize she was just as ready for this as he was. She wasn't just the fierce warrior he had first met. She had become something more in his eyes, an ally. And in a world like this, where survival depended on strength, allies were more important than anything else. "Stay close," Ethan said as they moved forward. He had no idea what kind of forces they would face, but he knew one thing: the element of surprise was their best shot. Arlakoth gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain around them. She was always alert, her senses heightened, taking in everything with a warrior's precision. Ethan couldn't help but admire her. She had a way of moving that was both graceful and deadly, as if every step was calculated, every movement purposeful. As they approached the clearing where the battle was taking place, Ethan could see the shape of the enemy forces beginning to take form. A dozen or so alien soldiers, armed with energy weapons and heavy armor, were gathered near a damaged transport ship. They were too preoccupied with their own fight to notice Ethan and Arlakoth at first. "Now's our chance," Ethan whispered, gripping his blaster tightly. Arlakoth didn't answer with words. Instead, she moved forward with a fluidity that only someone trained in combat could achieve. She was a force of nature, a silent predator stalking her prey. Ethan followed her lead, knowing that they had to act quickly. If they could take down the enemy leader, the rest of the forces would likely scatter, allowing them to regroup and make a plan. They closed the distance between them and the enemy soldiers, the noise of the battle growing louder. Ethan could feel his pulse racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had been in battles before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about fighting for survival. This was about something deeper. This was about standing up for what they both believed in. Arlakoth was the first to strike. She moved like lightning, her blaster rifle firing in quick succession. Two soldiers dropped to the ground, their bodies twitching as the energy blasts hit them. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his own blaster and fired. The first shot hit an enemy soldier in the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. The second shot hit another soldier in the chest, knocking him back. The remaining soldiers were scrambling now, trying to find cover and return fire, but they were disorganized, panicking. Arlakoth didn't give them a chance. She moved with deadly efficiency, each shot landing with precision. Ethan did his part too, using his training to pick off the soldiers who tried to escape. In less than 5 minutes, the enemy was neutralized. Ethan stood in the center of the battlefield, panting, his chest heaving with the effort. He couldn't believe how quickly it had all happened. One moment they were planning their attack, and the next it was over. The enemy soldiers were scattered across the ground, their bodies still and lifeless. The fight was won, but there was no time to relax. Ethan turned to Arlakoth, who was already scanning the surroundings, her eyes sharp and alert. "We need to make sure there aren't any more forces nearby," she said, her voice low but steady. "They'll send reinforcements." Ethan nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. He knew she was right. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. They still had a long way to go. The two of them moved quickly, checking the perimeter of the battlefield. It was quiet now, the only sounds the distant crackle of fires and the low hum of the damaged transport ship. There was no sign of more enemy forces, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a feeling he had learned to trust over the years, the sensation that something was just out of reach, lurking in the shadows. As they moved back toward the wreckage of the transport, Arlakoth suddenly stopped, her eyes narrowing as she studied the surroundings. Ethan followed her gaze, instinctively reaching for his blaster again. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But something doesn't feel right." Before Ethan could respond, a loud explosion rang out from behind them. The force of the blast knocked them both off their feet, sending them sprawling to the ground. Ethan felt the world spin as he tried to regain his bearings. His ears were ringing, and he struggled to push himself up. Arlakoth was already on her feet, her blaster raised, scanning the area for any signs of movement. Ethan followed her lead, pulling himself up and moving behind a large rock for cover. "What was that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking slightly from the shock of the blast. "A trap," Arlakoth said grimly. "They knew we were coming." Ethan's heart sank. He had known the risks, but he hadn't expected something like this. They had been too focused on taking out the soldiers, and now they were paying the price. The enemy had laid an ambush for them, and it had worked. But they weren't done yet. Ethan could hear the sound of more footsteps approaching, the clatter of armor, the click of weapons being loaded. The enemy was closing in. "We need to move now," Arlakoth said, her voice urgent. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. They both darted from their cover, moving quickly through the rocky terrain. The blasts of energy weapons filled the air as the enemy opened fire. Ethan ducked behind another rock, barely avoiding a shot that singed the edge of his jacket. Arlakoth was beside him in an instant, her rifle raised, firing back at the advancing soldiers. The enemy was relentless, pressing forward with determination. Ethan could see the leader of the enemy forces in the distance, a towering alien figure barking orders to his soldiers. "That's our target," Arlakoth said, her voice cold with resolve. "Take him out and the rest will fall." Ethan nodded, knowing that this was their chance. If they could eliminate the leader, the battle would be over. But getting close to him wouldn't be easy. The leader was well protected by his soldiers, and they were closing in fast. Arlakoth turned to Ethan, her eyes locked on his. "Follow me." Without another word, she took off, moving with a speed and precision that left Ethan no choice but to follow. He ran after her, his blaster raised, his mind focused on the task at hand. They dodged behind rocks and debris, weaving in and out of the battlefield as the enemy continued to fire at them. Finally, they reached the leader. He was standing behind a large piece of wreckage, shouting orders to his remaining soldiers. He didn't see them coming until it was too late. Arlakoth was the first to strike, her blaster aimed at the leader's chest. Ethan followed her lead, taking down the soldiers who tried to shield the leader. Within seconds, the battle had shifted in their favor. The leader fell to the ground, his weapon slipping from his hands. The remaining soldiers hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But it didn't last long. Arlakoth and Ethan made quick work of them, eliminating the last of the enemy forces. When the battle was finally over, the only sounds were the distant crackle of fire and the heavy breathing of Ethan and Arlakoth. The battlefield was silent, save for the occasional groan of the wreckage. Ethan stood there for a moment, his body aching from the fight. He had survived. They had survived. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more. Arlakoth turned to him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice carrying a sense of finality. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, we did." For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. And for the first time, he wondered if there was something more to their partnership than just survival. Something that neither of them had expected. But that was a question for another time. The battle had been won. The enemy forces lay scattered across the battlefield, their weapons silenced and their leader defeated. Ethan stood in the aftermath, his breath heavy as he surveyed the scene. The dust and smoke from the explosions hung in the air, thick and choking, but there was a strange calm now. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. But amidst the chaos, one thing was clear: they had survived. Together. Arlakoth was beside him, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes scanning the battlefield with the same intensity as ever. Even after the fight was over, she remained alert, as if waiting for something more to happen. Ethan had seen that look in her eyes before, a warrior's vigilance, the constant awareness of danger lurking just beyond the horizon. But this time, there was something else in her gaze, something softer, more uncertain. He glanced at her, taking in the way she held herself, strong, proud, but not unyielding. The fierce warrior he had first met was still there, but now she seemed more human, more like him. Ethan realized that, somewhere along the way, they had stopped being just a human and an alien warrior. They had become something more, something he wasn't sure how to define, something beyond survival. "We did it," Arlakoth said quietly, her voice almost a whisper as she turned to him. Ethan nodded, but he didn't speak immediately. His mind was still racing, his thoughts tangled with everything that had happened. The fight, the way they had worked together, it was almost as if they were in sync, as if they understood each other without words. But that wasn't all. The connection between them had deepened over the past few days in ways that Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to face. It wasn't just the shared battles and the moments of survival. It was something more subtle, a shift in how they looked at each other, a mutual understanding that went beyond words. "We made a good team," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he was feeling. He wasn't sure what else to say. It wasn't just about the battle. It was about what they had become to each other, partners, allies, something more. Arlakoth's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time she allowed herself to relax. The edge that had always been present in her demeanor, that warrior's sharpness, softened just enough for Ethan to notice. She wasn't just the Talvani warrior now. She was Arlakoth, the one who had fought beside him, who had trusted him in the heat of battle. And in that moment she was no longer just an alien. She was someone who, in her own way, had become part of his world. "Perhaps we are," she said softly, almost to herself. Ethan didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked out over the battlefield, taking in the destruction. He had never been one for bloodshed or war, but this was different. He had fought to protect not just his own life, but the life of someone else. Arlakoth had fought for him just as he had fought for her. They had become something more than just survivors. They had become a team. But the war wasn't over. Ethan knew that. The battle had been one small victory, but there was still so much to be done. The Talvani weren't finished yet, and the rival factions would only continue to fight. The planet of Grivath 5 was still in the midst of a struggle for power, and Ethan had a role to play in it, even if it wasn't clear yet what that role was. Arlakoth seemed to read his mind. She stepped closer to him, her gaze steady. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice low but filled with determination. Ethan looked at her, his heart beating faster. He had no answers, only questions, but as he looked into her eyes, he realized something important. It didn't matter what came next. What mattered was that they faced it together. They didn't have to have all the answers. They didn't need to know the future. What they needed was to continue fighting, side by side, until they could see what the next step would be. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice quieter now, "but whatever happens, I'm not facing it alone." Arlakoth nodded, her expression softening even further. "Neither am I." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind blowing across the battlefield. The chaos had subsided, leaving only the quiet echoes of what had come before. Ethan could feel the weight of everything, the mission, the fight, the uncertain future, pressing down on him. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. He was with Arlakoth. And she was with him. The silence stretched between them, neither of them speaking, but both of them knowing what had changed. The bond they had formed wasn't something either of them had expected. It wasn't something that could be easily defined, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he had a purpose beyond survival. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a scout. He was part of something bigger, a partnership, a connection, a reason to fight beyond just staying alive. "Let's go," Arlakoth said after a long pause, her voice steady once more. "There's more to be done." Ethan nodded and followed her, the two of them walking side by side through the battlefield. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the wreckage of the conflict. They didn't speak as they walked, but the unspoken understanding between them was stronger than ever. The galaxy was a dangerous place. Grivath 5 was a harsh world filled with violence and chaos. But here, in the midst of the destruction, Ethan realized something. The strength they had shown together was something that neither of them could ignore. And no matter what came next, they would face it with the same courage, the same resolve, and the same bond that had been forged in the fires of battle. As they moved forward, Ethan couldn't help but think that, perhaps for the first time in his life, he wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was living, and he was living for someone that he couldn't have imagined just days before. And Arlakoth, the Talvani warrior who had once seemed so distant, now felt like more than just a companion. She felt like something more, something he couldn't yet fully understand, but something he knew he needed in this vast, dangerous galaxy. The future was uncertain, the road ahead unclear, but one thing was certain. They would face it together, and that was enough.